Mounce, BBG, chapter 18, sentence 10, last one. All right, now what you have, I want you to notice here, you have multiple you have the disciples of John, and then you have the Pharisees, and you notice they're both nominative plural nouns here. So you have two subjects, and then you have, not only that, you have a Kai here and a Kai here. Hopefully you know by now that when you have two Kais like that, connecting two very similar ideas, and what you have is you need to translate that as a both and, not simply and blah 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 and blah blah blah. It's better translation in this particular instance because you have a Kai before both subjects to translate it as both something and something else. And that's really what we have here. So once again, the disciples of John, hopefully you recognize this as of John. Now you could do John's disciples, fine, whatever. But both the disciples of John and the Pharisees, and then you have multiple, you have two verbs. So I want you to notice here you have a passive ending. Here you have an active ending. But the difference is that this one comes from a deponent verb. So even though it is a passive ending, you're going to translate it actively. And hopefully you remember the reason for that is because the lexical form that you memorized is erchomai. And as soon as you say erchomai, because that's what you learned it as, you know it's deponent. So once again, both the disciples of John and the Pharisees come and say, and again, they're both third plurals, which is what you'd need to line up in terms of subject-verb agreement. So you know that's third plural, you know that's third plural with the movable nu. So that works. So both the disciples of John and the Pharisees come and say to him, all right? And again, from Lego, it's typically going to line up as a to him. And then you have the quotation marked. And then because of why? Because of why? All right? As soon as you see dia, you ought to think of because of. And then T, who, what, or why. Or because of what? Because of why. Those are kinds of things. But it's a question. And that's verified down here. Not only do you have the interrogative T, and you know that because of the acute accent, but you also have the question mark to confirm that your suspicions are correct. So because of why, that's obviously an expression. So, you could say something like, for what reason? It's decent translation. And a lot of people in a scenario like this, because it's an expression, essentially it's equivalent of why. So, you would be okay to just go with why in this particular environment. But, literally something like because of why or because of what. So, you'd be okay to do why or for what reason. Would be a perfectly fine translation in this scenario. So, for what reason do the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees, you notice, so he calls them both disciples, but it's the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees. And then do they fast? And you have another third plural verb, so that makes perfect sense. Lines up with those plural subjects in this environment. So for what reason do the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, comma, and here's one because he's trying to contrast. So while if they were at the beginning, a lot of times in a narrative that would be and, here he's clearly trying to contrast between the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees and your disciples. The odd piece of this is that soy, even though it's a dative, if you notice that's a dative, it's still possessive in this environment. And many times that's what you find when you talk about your name or your disciples, the disciples to you. Well, that's kind of odd. It doesn't collocate for us, but it would for them. What is the name to you? Would be a very common thing in the New Testament to read. But the idea is it's a dative, but it's a dative that shows possession. So in this case, it's your disciples. Even though this is a dative, it's demonstrating possession because of what it's going with. So, but your disciples, and then it's negated. They do not. Again, third plural. They, why don't? But your disciples don't fast. Don't fast. So one more time, and the disciples of John and the Pharisees come and say to him, and of course, guess what these are? Both of these historical presents. So you're perfectly fine if you went with translating it as though it were a past tense, as long as you understand that both of them are technically presents. No big deal. So the disciples of John and the Pharisees came and said to him, for what reason do the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Question mark.